You're listening to Word of Mouth from BBC Radio 4. When I was at grammar school in the 1950s, they spent many hours teaching us how to lay out an address on an envelope, and indeed how to lay out the letter inside. So on the envelope, we had to have all the commas in the right place. If it was addressed to a man, it had to have ESQ, ESQ, full stop, comma. It had to be in the bottom right-hand corner rectangle of the envelope. And they spent hours and hours on this, and they told us to be pedantic about it. That's what they told us. And then, between then and now, the whole lot has been dispensed with. I've no idea how that happened. It just disappeared. So what was I being pedantic about? Well, I'm joined in studio by Oliver Cam, who's a leader writer and columnist for The Times. Oliver, you say that you used to be a pedant. Tell us what got your goat. Or, actually, as it happens, I was once corrected on that and somebody said, it's not goat, it should be goad. But there you go. What got your goat?
Yes, I am a reformed stickler, a reformed pedant. I decided that pedantry was not only bad manners but poor scholarship for two reasons in particular, or on two grounds in particular. I read about linguistics and I read about cognitive science, and specifically the work of Steven Pinker, the author of The Language Instinct, one of the great non-fiction books of the last quarter century, and realised two things absolutely crucial to the language debate. First, where language is concerned, there's no one in charge. There's no committee to decide what is correct usage. Usage is what the language is, not any usage, not anything that comes out of the mouth of President George W. Bush, but
or
general usage, indeed, or even me, but general usage. General usage is what the language is. There's no external rule-making body deciding it. And secondly, I discovered that the view of most linguists, not all of them, but most linguists, is that language is the realization of an innate human faculty. It's not some delicate artifact of civilization, of culture. It's not constantly under threat. It's something absolutely intrinsic to who we are. Some human skills are acquired skills, things like driving a car or playing a violin, but language is absolutely intrinsic to who we are, and it's a much more resilient force than the pedants who are always seeing apocalypse and decline just around the corner give credit for. So those two realizations on my part made me question pedantry, not only as bad manners but as poor scholarship as well.
Lovely. You've laid out your case. So you've undergone this conversion, Oliver. You've now written a book, Accidents Will Happen, accident spelt E-N-C-E, the non-pedantic guide to English usage. Dr. Laura Wright, reader in English language at the University of Cambridge, is our expert linguist, but is she a pedant? We'll find out. So linguists have got to try and describe this. Let me see if I've got this absolutely right. So someone who is a descriptivist just says, what I'm doing is describing the language as it is used. But a prescriptivist, someone who's prescribing how it should be, is saying this is how it ought to be used.
Exactly.
Yes? Is that right?
Yes.
Right.
What linguists say is that standard English is not defined by prescriptivist rules as taught to generations of school children and indeed repeated by pedants, but it's actually what is it that people really do and trying to discover what speakers really say and to write a grammar of that. So the kind of rules that Oliver has been debunking in his new book, for example, to pick preposition stranding. Now, this is the rule which says that you shouldn't put a preposition at the end of a sentence, and a preposition is one of those small words like to and over and of. But that's where they can sit in English. There's no rule prohibiting that in English.
So how is this a guide to English usage if there are no rules?
There are certainly rules of grammar. There are certainly rules of grammar, lots of them. And linguists love rules of grammar. They're constantly trying to identify what is grammatically possible and what is not grammatically possible. But the things that linguists mean by rules of grammar are very complex constructions that we never get wrong. Things like word order or inflection for tense or number.
Don't we get word order wrong?
We can if we're soporific or if we're inebriated, but no, not usually. We know that the parts of speech normally go in a particular order that makes sense and not in other orders that don't make sense. I'll give you a tiny example of that sort of rule. Adjective, the order of adjectives, of attributive adjectives, those that precede the noun. We always say little black book, not black little book. We always say that. Why do we say that? Because there is a rule of grammar that attributive adjectives of size precede those of colour. It's not something we've ever been taught at school or by our parents. It's a rule that we have acquired. There are rules of grammar. We don't get them wrong. The reason for my book is first to explain that the pedantic impulse, which has such sway in public debate over language, and particularly in the media where I work, that pedantic urge is mistaken. And secondly,
it's kind of trigger-fingerish, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It's not exploring what we can do with language. It's finding fault with the way that native speakers use their own language and fluent non-native speakers use the English language.
So would you go so far as to say that it's actually impossible to make a mistake? Are you going that far with this?
No, not at all. It's certainly possible to make a mistake. I, as a journalist working on a daily national newspaper with a tight deadline, am as aware as anyone of the possibility of making mistakes in English, things like typographical errors and sometimes subject-verb agreement is out. Of course, it's possible for you, for me, for our listeners to make mistakes.
Just remind us of subject-verb agreement so we all know we're all reading from the same hymn sheet on this one.
Yes, a plural subject needs a plural verb.
So give us a plural subject. Boys, let's say.
The boys were in detention. That's subject-verb agreement. It is a genuine rule of the grammar of standard English, not necessarily other variants of English, that there must be agreement in number between subject and verb.
The boys were in detention rather than the boys is in detention.
Exactly so. That's a rule of the grammar of standard English.
Well, what about the psychology of this, though? Because we can say, all right, there are pedants or prescriptivists, and over here are descriptivists, and we don't want to say that people are bad, but you used to be a pedant, right? That's presumably because you wanted rules in language, and some people are worried about linguistic change. So what is it? Is it to do with nostalgia? Is there something to do with order? You know, the world is very chaotic, so if you can at least say, well, there should be subject-verb agreement, we shouldn't say we was, we have to say we were, in a sense it gives them some kind of confidence or something to hold on to. I don't want to sound patronising in any way at all, but there must be an important, valid psychology behind this.
Yes, I've been there. I don't wish to be too hard on myself. When I was a stickler, I was not a particularly fanatical one. I would happily use stranded prepositions and split infinitives and so forth. But I did hold to the view that, particularly in semantics, meaning, certain words meant certain things, and to allow alternative meanings to be used in public life would detract from them. Words like disinterested, meaning impartial, or enormity, meaning moral gravity. Now, my view is that the urge of the pedant is partly, as you suggest, Michael, a yearning for order, and it's also a feature of the history of the language debates that in every generation, in every century, people are worrying about the supposed decline of linguistic standards. You get it throughout the ages. Defoe worried about it, Swift worried about it. 50 years later, Dr. Johnson wrote the most remarkable prose, thereby refuting them. I use the word refute in a sense that pedants will like, meaning disprove. And it always happens. In current debate, we're always hearing from columnists, political columnists, not usually language columnists, but political columnists, that there's a problem of declining standards of literacy. And I always want to ask them, what's the golden age you're going back to? In the middle of the last century, if you read the autobiographies of public figures of the time, in let's say, Dirk Bogart's autobiography, he records that when he was serving in the army, he was astonished to discover that most of his platoon was illiterate. There was secondary education at the time, following the Butler Act of 1944, but large numbers of people were illiterate. And in fact, standards of literacy have never been higher in this country than they are now. But people worry because they sense that language is changing, which of course it is. It's always doing that. But they don't grasp that language is a self-regulating system. Words that perish are replaced by others. And the grammar of the language, the way we understand each other, the way we fit words together to form sentences, that never breaks down. If you don't understand something I say, then I recast it until you do understand.
That's all right in face-to-face with speech. But writing is different because I can't necessarily unpack what's on the page if it's somewhere or another wrongly constituted because it doesn't fit my own pattern. So what's on the page and what's face-to-face is different, isn't it?
Yes, it is, absolutely. And one of the reasons that I've written my book is to give guidance in the area of language where I think it can help, namely communicating by writing to a range of audiences. Yes, it is possible to give sensible advice, I hope, and I hope I've given it, on style, but I'm not going to tell native English speakers and fluent non-native speakers of English you don't know the language, because they disprove that proposition by the way they speak and write all the time.
And this is actually exactly where those rules started life, with people trying to do exactly that. So to give you one example, Thomas Sheridan in the 1780s, he's an out-of-work actor, he's Irish, there he is in Drury Lane trying to make a living, failing, going bankrupt.
Father of the playwright?
Father of the playwright, Richard Sheridan. So what's an actor's stock in trade? It's accents.
Yes.
It's
spieling.
Speaking on the stage, it's speaking, convincing the public. So what he did, great entrepreneur, he set up a series of lecture tours around Britain. And he went around Britain, and what he basically did was to tell all the people who came, all the people who are fresh off the farm, because after all, this is the Industrial Revolution. They were...
People moving from the country to the city.
Exactly, yeah. They're reinventing themselves. And what he did was to say, you're not speaking elegantly. You are not speaking politely, and those are loaded words in the 18th century, elegant and polite. And so they, nobody had ever been told that there was anything wrong with their accent or their dialect before, but they were deeply unsettled. And so the obvious place for all the kind of bandwagon jumpers to look to is Neo-Latin, and I specify Neo because Neo-Latin is a written form with fixed rules, unlike spoken Latin, medieval Latin, which is as variable as any other variety.
So are you saying that pedantry at this time was to do with comportment and politeness and fitting in with society's norms?
Well,
that's
yes,
what pedantry was at that time.
It's effectively being accepted by the middle classes. There you are, just one generation back, you're an agricultural labourer, but now you're working in a factory or whatever you're doing in the town. And so you can begin to give yourself airs and graces. And Thomas Sheridan would say, I can tell you how to do it. This is how you do it. And equally the prescriptivists of his generation. But the trouble is, they invented rules, usually from Neo-Latin, and they ported them into English. And so everybody thought, oh my goodness, I didn't know I wasn't meant to be doing it this way. I've got to do it that way. I mustn't split infinitives. I mustn't strand my prepositions. I ought to say between you and me instead of between you and... Things which nobody had... they'd just been variants before. And so because they were unsettled and they latched onto these things, generations of school teachers have perpetuated them. And so pedants tend to think this is the right way to do it without asking, what is this rightness? What is this correctness? If language is full of variation, that means there are variants. There's more than one way of saying things. Words mean more than one thing, and always have done and always will.
Have you escaped from that kind of pedantry? You're not that kind of pedant, but couldn't we read your book and see, in a sense, it's another kind of pedantry? You're not saying anything goes, but you are laying down some rules. I think I read that John Rentoul, the journalist, he said that you imply that it is all right, two separate words, or all right, one word, to write in a way that you, Oliver, would not. How do you respond to John's critique there?
In two ways. First, my argument is that I don't want to counterpose a sort of anti-pedantry to pedantry. I'm not saying the pedant's rules are wrong and mine are right. I'm saying that the range of legitimate variation in standard English, never mind any other variant of English, is much wider than the pedants suppose. For example, all right spelt as two words is often held up as the only way to do it, and as one wag put it, all right spelt as one word is all wrong spelt as one word. But in fact, it's not. We have the examples of alone and altogether. There's no reason at all, no linguistic reason at all, that we should not spell all right as one word with one L. And my second response to my friend and competitor, John Rentoul, is the task of language instruction, which I hold very dear and believe very strongly should be taught well in schools and understood by children and adults, is not to assimilate a set of rules, many of which, as Laura says, were derived from Neo-Latin and don't have much grammatical sense behind them. The task is to learn how to write well to a range of audiences. Linguists use the term register to describe the particular style to adopt in different circumstances. For example, if you're commemorating some great event, some great tragedy, like the Holocaust, as we saw on television screens recently, you need a very, very formal use of English, or any other language. You need a highly formal register. If you're talking to your loved one, I doubt that even the most obdurate of pedant would use standard English all the time, or a child, or a cat. We go from a range of informality to high formality, and the task of language teaching should be to tell children, first, what the conventions of standard English are, not necessarily the rules, because if they're already speakers of standard English, they know the rules, but it also should be to tell them the most effective way to communicate in different contexts to different audiences. That's something where tuition, explicit tuition, has a great deal to offer.
And what about the word pedant itself, actually? Laura,
yes.
where does that come from?
Well, the word pedant comes from French, and it means, on the one hand, both schoolmaster, but also somebody who's showing off his learning, and you can quite understand how the two could be conflated if the off-duty schoolmaster is continuing to lecture when he's down the pub or something. You can
That's
see
Shakespeare's gag in Love's Labour's Lost with Holofernes, isn't it? He keeps lecturing people about
Sure.
the right way to be.
He draweth out the thread of his verbosity, exactly.
Quite. But this can be done with kindness of intent as well. I mean, it's not necessarily done deliberately to bore or indeed to castigate. I mean, it can
to prove one-upmanship, which is another element in the game, or it can be.
Yes, I certainly, in real life, what I've come across is people being terribly concerned about the job interview. This is what I hear parents being worried about. If there are no rules, or if my child's speaking like an American rapper, they're not going to get, a job in a job interview. And this kind of bogeyman of the job interview is worrying them. As though people were incapable of style shifting, as though people were incapable of using the correct register for the correct occasion. Actually, a job interview happens very rarely. It's very formal. All of us find it hard. I mean, show me the person who sails through a job interview. Yes, they're terrifying in all sorts of ways, not least what you look like. So getting your language, or being worried about your language for that specific occasion, which is going to occur rather infrequently in life, bears no relation to your everyday experience of shifting registers according to what you're doing.
Lynn Truss, Eat, Shoots and Leaves, I know a rather rude version of that, by the way, which I won't repeat, has been quoted as saying that pointing out mistakes has become associated with, she called it this, mean-spiritedness, snobbishness and judgmentalism. Do you think you were once a bit like that? Do you think sometimes, Oliver, doing a little bit of self-examination here, that were you infected by that, and partly your way out of it is to relieve yourself of this burden that you did sometimes want to say? I see it on social media. Someone makes a point, they make a mistake, and the next point on the social media says, you just said what's it or something, and they then criticise it as if that's a criticism of the argument. But obviously they feel great. They've just criticised the other person for something, the surface features of language, if you like.
I won't be too hard on myself. I don't think I was that obnoxious. And as Laura just said, there is a certain kindly intent in prescriptive advice as well.
OK, so let's use some other terms. See, I know from personal experience that there are Radio 4 listeners, and indeed word-of-mouth listeners, hello all, out there who do think that there is such a thing, and we actually need this, of correct and incorrect. That's a structure, that's a shape, if you like, that people really like, and that mistakes definitely can be made. You have to tell children, or indeed, I don't know, someone driving a bus necessarily. Some people I see do it. So what would you say to somebody who says there must be correct and incorrect? Here we are on the BBC, and I'm trying to be correct for the listeners. Otherwise, I'll get letters in saying you just had a hanging participle or even a dangling one, even worse.
I would say, yes, it's perfectly possible to make mistakes in English usage, to be incorrect in your usage. Of course it is. It's absolutely possible. But the things that the pedants complain about, to take your example of the dangling participle, that, in my view, is not a grammatical error. It is, at worst, a stylistic infelicity, because it can confuse a reader on first reading and therefore is worth avoiding.
So let's do a dangling participle. Shall we have some dangling participles round the table?
Let me give you one that I think I can quote from memory, but I hope readers won't criticise me if I get it wrong. It's from Hamlet. Sleeping in my orchard, a serpent stung me. That is a dangling participle.
Because the serpent...
because it wasn't the serpent doing the sleeping.
Yeah.
Yet, I'm not going to criticise Shakespeare's English. I'm not...
well, it's interesting that that's exactly what you would have to do if you were going to be pedantic.
Exactly, that's what you would have to do. Shakespeare used a dangling participle. It's not confusing. It's poetic. It's brilliant, in fact.
I agree. It's instructive to listen to some pedantic complaints from the past. Do you get upset, for example, about, if I give you a phrase like, I would like a cup of coffee? Was there anything wrong with that?
Some pedants even now would say I should like a cup of coffee.
So you think the wrong choice of modal. What people got upset about in the past was I didn't pronounce my L in wood.
Oh, of course.
There was a generation
How did you
who
say
were
it?
appalled,
No,
who
wood.
thought, well, indeed, and they thought that the language was going to the dogs, that, the heavens would disperse frogs and toads or whatever, because we were all abandoning our L's. Even worse, I asked for coffee.
Coffee? What's the matter with coffee?
Diana Mitford, in her memoirs, says that the Mitford girls,
yes,
Lord and Lady Redesdale's daughters, apparently they made their governess's life an absolute misery because she said coffee. She should have said coffee. I would like a cup of coffee.
That's very American,
coffee.
Actually. Like a cup of coffee.
Some dialect areas, some accents have retained it, but in the RP accent in most of the southeastern English, so far as I know, we've gone to coffee, and we're not upset anymore about it.
And they did do hunting, shooting, and fishing, didn't they? After all,
oh, certainly,
they dropped their G's, as people used to say. But very
yes. Well, it was the
them.
middle classes who reinstated their G's. It's not that they dropped their G's; it's that we all didn't pronounce the G after the Old English period, so I don't know, 1100, 1200. We were all hunting, shooting, fishing, as indeed we mostly do around the world, in Englishes everywhere. Yeah. But the middle classes who got so upset by Thomas Sheridan and his ilk, by the prescriptivists, well, of course you ought to pronounce it. There's a G at the end of the word, so you ought to pronounce it. So what are we going to do? We're going to turn back the clock and say, well, because that was a load of rubbish, we're all going to do just hunting, shooting, fishing. The upper classes did until very recently. They've only just recently joined the middle classes there. Or we're going to say, well, there's a prescriptivist rule that really has put back time, as it were.
Well, I'm concerned with maintaining standards. So I've got something to show you here. Let me distribute them. There's a nice picture. There you go, and there. So let me describe for the listeners. We're looking at a picture of a hoodie. I mean, the hoodie itself, not the person. Oh, interesting little bit of grammar there. So we're looking at the hoodie. And on the front of the hoodie is a map of the British Isles, and it's red, white and blue. It's a kind of Union flag there. Underneath it, it says WERE #1. I think we can assume that should really be we're number one. We're the Brits, we're number one. But of course it's actually come out as were number one. Doesn't that show that there must be rules about apostrophes? I can't believe I'm saying this, as I've been on radio several times in my life saying, let's do away with the apostrophe. Even had arguments with John Humphreys, another one of your
sparring partners,
indeed. So doesn't this tell us, even though whether it's a joke or not a joke, that actually the problem is, if you want an apostrophe, you need an apostrophe to distinguish were from... can't even say it. Were from we're.
Isn't that interesting? You've just been able to tell the difference between were and we're despite the absence of an apostrophe. So strictly we don't need an apostrophe, but yes, it is a convention, not a rule of grammar, but a convention of orthography, that is spelling and punctuation, that with a contraction of we are, you need an apostrophe. But the apostrophe in written English, of course it's just in written English, not in the spoken form of the language, and spoken English doesn't become unintelligible through the absence of the apostrophe. The apostrophe is a recent development in the history of English. It came into the language, relatively recent. It came into the language, I think, in the 16th century as a printer's convenience, and the rules of for use of the apostrophe, and particularly as a genitive marker to mark possession, they only settled down about 1800 with the rise of mechanised printing.
But it's not all that recent. That does mean it's been about, for whatever it is, 4 generations a century. That's 4 times 4, 16 generations.
If you consider that the history of written English goes back about 1,000 years, that is quite recent.
Right.
I'm not disputing that there are right and wrong ways of using the apostrophe. I'm suggesting that it's a convention for convenience and concision and comprehensibility that doesn't apply in the spoken language at all. It doesn't exist in the spoken language. And yes, you ask me, is that a mistake? Let's assume, for sake of argument, given your hypothesis, that it's a mistake. I've got no problem with saying that. All I'm saying is don't have a cow about it. It is what it is.
So am I getting the message from you two that this is just something to do with relaxing? Is that what we're doing? Are we saying ease up out there to the world? Is that what you two are both saying?
Not quite so simplistically. I mean, to go back to your apostrophe, of course there is a usage. There is a usefulness in being able to have a global lingua franca, which is what written standard English has recently become, only in recent centuries. It is everybody's right to learn it. It doesn't matter whether you're born in London, from a standard English RP household, whether you're born in Kuala Lumpur, whether you're born in Norway, whether you're born on a remote island, whether you're born in Liverpool. It is your right to learn it. And since the 1870 Education Act, that is what has been taught to girls and boys in school, precisely so that they have an entree, as it were, to the wide world, so that they will be taken seriously when they wish to contribute, in exactly the same way that it is your right to learn the rules of Castilian Spanish, and then that will open up the Hispanic world to you, or your right to learn High German, and that will open up several million more speakers and writers and readers to you. These are systems of mass communication. But you really don't have to believe the made-up rules of an 18th century out-of-work Irish actor and his ilk. Those are not rules. Those are simply stylistic preferences.
Laura Wright, Oliver Cam, thanks very much. And I'm just musing on the hours of my life that disappeared when I was doing all those commas in the laying out of those addresses in my grammar school in the 1950s. Goodbye. Thanks for listening. You can find other programmes about language and society at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.